So today we're going to begin with 3 presentations on legacies. Janice Forsyth, sorry, I was looking at you, Robert. Janice Forsyth, who's the director of the International Centre for Olympic Studies at Western, will be speaking about From Culture to Culture, Real and Stated Benefits to Aboriginal Involvement in Olympic Games. Then we have Robert Kerr, very honoured to have him participate today, who of course is the director of Vancouver 2010 Cultural Olympiad. And he's going to be speaking to us on making a good thing last, leveraging mega events for long-term cultural development. And then Kelsey Blair from Theatre at UBC will speak on hockey sticks and heartstrings, the effective legacy of the Vancouver 2010 Olympics. Peter's asked me to keep to time, so everybody will be speaking for 20 minutes. I'll give a 2-minute warning, and that way hopefully we can have enough time for discussion at the end. So Janice, I'll hand over to you. As Robert's sitting here, I wonder if Kelsey, you might also join us in the panel. At the end of the presentations, when we have discussion, I'll invite the 3 of you to stay here on the table to open it out to everybody. So thank you, Janice.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and especially Peter for the invitation. It's not often I get to speak to a crowd outside of my usual area, which is history and sociology. And I've been the director of the Center for Olympic Studies at Western since 2010. I came into my job and rolled right into the Vancouver Winter Olympics, and it's been a huge learning curve all the way through, that's for sure. We're the only center in the world that isn't funded by the IOC, so that allows us to maintain a critical stance on issues, and we like to do that. We do a lot of media. It's probably how we are best known outside of our publications and our biannual conference. We do everything from the BBC to the New York Times to local press, student press, and it's always fun talking to media. You never know what they're going to print. My interest in the Olympic Games is more political. It's not my primary area of research. It's my interest now is more in the history of physical culture in Indian residential schools in Canada. But I do have an interest in the Olympic Games because it's where my educational background comes from. I'm a historian by trade, but I'm interested in how policies help to shape what we think people can do with the Olympic Games, this behemoth of a sporting event, which really isn't a sporting event at all. It's the biggest advertising venue in the world. That's the way I see the Games. So I'm interested in something called Agenda 21 and the way in which Agenda 21 has restructured the power relationships between different groups of people, in this case, Aboriginal people and Olympic organizers. I was interested in Vancouver 2010 because of how I noticed some things were the same historically and whether or not some things had changed, because that was sort of the discourse in the media at the time for Vancouver 2010. There was this huge celebration around how much things had changed, especially for Aboriginal people. And I began to unpack that a little bit by looking at Agenda 21 and wondering whether or not things had actually changed. And if you might recall, Aboriginal imagery and commodities were everywhere. They were ubiquitous throughout the Games. Everything from live performances to medals to trinkets, Coke bottles, downloadable ringtones, anything that could be sold for profit was sold for profit. And you can see some of the images behind me. And in this regard, little seems to have changed since the earliest days of Aboriginal involvement in the Games, where Aboriginal people were onlookers for tourists who were coming to the Games. Aboriginal performers and Aboriginal imagery were used to project specific political messages at home and abroad, not only for Vancouver 2010, but for Games past. The Vancouver Bid Book for 2010 tells us that Canada is a living mosaic of peoples and cultures from around the world. Virtually every nation has joined Canada's First Nations, making us a truly multicultural society. In Vancouver, as in Games past, Aboriginal cultures were packaged and sold for commercial profit. And for 2010, this is part of a long process of the commodification of Aboriginal cultures for the masses, only with Agenda 21, as it was implemented in Vancouver, the process has now become institutionalized. And certainly some things are different, or some things were different for Vancouver. Organizers worked hard to achieve their goal of unprecedented Aboriginal involvement in the Games. And of note here is the For-Host First Nations Society, which was a non-profit organization that was developed to facilitate Aboriginal inclusion in the Games, welcome the world to their traditional territories, host an outstanding Olympic Games, and showcase First Nation cultures as a vibrant and integral part of Canada's rich and diverse heritage. Aboriginal involvement in the Games was essential to awarding Vancouver the rights to host, so much so that Jack Poole, chairman of the board for VANOC, publicly stated, "If it hadn't been for the full support of the four host First Nations in our bid, we likely wouldn't be talking about Vancouver 2010 today." There's two Agenda 21s that are related to each other, so I'll just need to explain those briefly for context. There's the United Nations Agenda 21, which was ratified in 1992, of which there are 40 chapters that deal with the environment. Chapter 26 deals with Indigenous people and the environment and frames them as knowledge holders and users of the land, so they're important people to consult when governments and industry go into their lands to exploit the environment. Governments and NGOs throughout the world were encouraged to adopt this Agenda 21 from the United Nations. Now, a few words on the IOC. There's quite a bit to say about the IOC as a business corporation, but basically it's registered as an international non-governmental organization, an NGO. But it has the powers and operates as a private corporation, but it has membership in the United Nations, virtually every kind of important portfolio at the United Nations it sits on. It also often has more member nations than the United Nations, which makes it one of the most powerful NGOs in the world. It also has enjoys the benefits of what we call extraterritoriality, and that means that it sits outside of state law. So it's a powerful organization. So when the Olympic Games roll into Vancouver, you are essentially not in Vancouver, Canada anymore. You are in Olympia. It's a different space and has the power to use, for instance, paramilitary forces to pull together a different type of military organization. The IOC's Agenda 21 is based on the United Nations Agenda 21. It was adopted and ratified in 1999. It is a five-pronged approach for dealing with partnerships and collaboration, sport and youth, economic development, cultural involvement, awareness and education in the Olympic Games. The details surrounding the benefits are vague. If you were to go there, it's a beautifully worded policy document, as they often are. But the plan ensures that Aboriginal people will be involved in practically every aspect of the Games, even at the highest levels of administration. After more than 100 years of participating in the Olympic Games, with Agenda 21, it finally seemed that Aboriginal people finally had a legitimate stake in the game. They had a voice at the IOC through this document. That's what it suggests. So it seemed as though with VANOC, the hosts, the organizers might have finally achieved unprecedented Aboriginal involvement. But this flows from sober calculations by the IOC to secure long-term or short-term profit and long-term viability as an organization. The IOC's Agenda 21, Sport for Sustainable Development, called for the inclusion of values of sustainability in the Olympic movement, which would be achieved in part by strengthening the role and participation of Indigenous people on three fronts: by encouraging their sporting traditions, contributing to the use of traditional knowledge in environmental management, and by encouraging their access to sports participation. This is fairly weak terminology, of course, encouraging these benefits. Member organizations of the IOC were invited to comply with the recommendations, but of course, in the competitive bidding process, these are never recommendations. They are generally understood as a tantamount to a directive. The Agenda 21, in other words, is basically a blueprint that each NOC is asked to follow. It's responsible for the particulars. It's a plan ostensibly responsive to local needs and interests. Vancouver 2010, their sustainability referred to managing the social, economic, environmental impacts and opportunities to produce lasting benefits for Aboriginal people. So implied in this interpretation of sustainability is a commitment by organizers to democratize the flow of capital, which suggests that Aboriginal people will finally share in the claimed benefits. But as a powerful organization, the Olympic enterprise focuses on the commodification of its properties, where the needs and interests of local and marginalized groups are too often brushed aside and disparaged. So embedded in this public discourse about a more equitable Olympic Aboriginal pairing is a paradox. There's nothing fundamentally new about Aboriginal involvement in 2010, except for the unprecedented mobilization of Aboriginal bodies, land, and insignia. And in this regard, Aboriginal inclusion was definitely different from past games. There were more performers, there were more artists, volunteers, cultural insignia, merchandise for sale than ever before. The paradox for me was that in spite of this increased visibility of Aboriginal people at these games, the power relations sustaining the historic inequities between two groups, Olympic organizers and Aboriginal people, were largely unchanged. In fact, I saw and I understand the ongoing accounts from Vancouver 2010 to suggest that the present-day arrangement for Aboriginal people has actually worsened because of Agenda 21 and the way it's institutionalized these relationships. So I'll just go through a bit of examples from history, because there is a long history of involvement of Aboriginal people in the Games, and it's easy to wipe away this history, but I like to remind people of what this involvement is, and I'm just narrowing it down briefly. Originally, when the Olympic Games first got started in 1896, I mean, no one knew about them, no one was interested, no one even did sport. Sport wasn't a cultural thing that people did worldwide. It was a bizarre thing, actually, that people did. So in the early years of the modern Olympic movement, the Games were attached to world fairs and expositions, and so it was in 1904, 1908 in Paris, and 1900, of course. And of course, there are always celebrations of different cultural values. So in 1904, the St. Louis Games was the centennial celebration of the St. Louis Purchase, or the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, this was a sale of land that opened up the West in the U.S. for westward expansion. And that led to the forced removal of thousands of Native people from their traditional territories. And it led to things like the Trail of Tears in the 1930s. So the exposition celebrated this theme. Aboriginal people or Indigenous people were involved in the 1904 Games, and they were actually central to the display. And they were brought in from different parts of the American Empire. They resided in native villages for the duration of the exposition, which lasted months at this point in time. They staged events for the amusement and education of the white crowds, and there they were showcased objects, and the utility rested in their ability to attract visitors, but their presence in this construction also served as living proof of white supremacy. And here you have an image which was titled "Return from the Bear Hunt, Eskimo Village." Included as part of the program of the Olympic Games was something called Anthropology Days. It was a 2-day sports competition where Indigenous people were pulled from the exhibit. And it was attached to the Olympic Games. It exemplified the theme of white physical supremacy. Here, Native people were, or the subject of physical training was premised on notions of cultural progress, which equated material wealth with technical advancement, with higher forms of civilization. Various competitions were held. Here you see spear throwing, but there was also archery, pole climbing, tug of war, mud wrestling, and the winners of the games were given American flags, not medals. Event organizers recorded the physical characteristics of the Native and white competitors and then compared the results. None of the Indigenous competitors, men only of course, were trained in these so-called sports, and the results were considered a legitimate scientific experiment, and it was linked to an Olympic lecture series on physical culture. Delegates observed and understood it as an objective demonstration of Indigenous physical inferiority. Comparisons reinforced discrimination and legitimized the harsh treatment of Indigenous people, such as Wounded Knee in 1890 and then the Trail of Tears that was to happen in the future. We wouldn't actually see Indigenous athletes in the Olympic Games until Longboat and Tawanama and Thorpe and Simpson until 1908, and then later on in the 20th century. In 1976, more recently, of course, ceremonies have become a focal point for television coverage and a magnet for massive corporate sponsorships. One of the interesting paradoxes of the Olympic Games, too, is that there is no corporate sponsorship symbols allowed in the venues of the Olympic Games, and so it has to be advertised in other ways, and we don't also see it in the stadium itself, but the sponsorships come through commercials and whatnot. And through the ceremonies, this is where host cities and host nations, they try to focus on favorable images of their city and their country. So it's engineered to show attractive national dimensions and to advance their reputations globally. Hosting the Games has never been about sporting events alone. You spend millions on this opening ceremonies. About $40 million was spent on Vancouver, and since then the amount of money that has been spent on the opening ceremonies has increased dramatically. The ceremonies are critical and one of the most watched aspects of the Games. This is where billions tune in to actually watch the show. John McAloon, I think, summed it up nicely. He's an Olympic historian, and he was talking about the power of this ceremony. He says, no other Olympic event, no other sport festival, no other cultural event, no arts performance, no church, no political movement, no other international organization, including the United Nations, indeed no other anything, has ever managed to generate regularly scheduled and predictable performances which command anywhere near the same focused global attention as do the Olympic ceremonies. So it's an important stage on which to project political images. When Aboriginal people are involved, they are almost always represented as harmonious. The history is always represented as harmonious and uncomplicated, and they're used to project a positive image of cultural diversity and respect for differences between people. We need to understand the 1976 ceremonies to the IOC, because it's also about the IOC and what it wants the world to understand its games as. So they're coming off the massacres of 1968, coming off of terrorism attack of 1972. So the major concern for 1976 was to give the world the best impression of Olympism. Also, host cities were beginning to pull out of hosting the Games. We see a decline in the number of hosts through 1976, 1980, and 1984. It was imperative that the 1976 Games be redeemed, or redeem the IOC and Olympism from past horrors. So they used the closing ceremonies to distinguish the Games as a humanizing force capable of bringing diverse groups of people together in peace, harmony, and friendship. And there they reproduced romantic notions of the Indian to convey these ideas.
2 minutes.
Okay. The ceremonies were promoted as a tribute to Aboriginal people to convey the idea of multiculturalism with its emphasis on emancipation and integration, Organizers invited local Aboriginal people to take part in the games, but the display was constructed for them entirely by non-Aboriginals. And so despite their non-involvement, about 300 local Aboriginal people took part in the games, and there's a reason for that I've done some research on, but it's not critical here. There were about 8 different communities that took part, and they danced alongside 250 non-native people who were dressed and painted to look like natives, and here you actually see a rendering. This is actually what the organizers produced, so it's not quite what I thought I would see from IOC or Olympic Archives, these hand-drawn sketches. To convey the idea of multiculturalism and oneness, organizers appropriated a variety of images and arranged them into vivid and dramatic displays with teepees, tom-toms, feathered headdresses, buckskin outfits, the men in the lead, the women in the back, all color coordinated to match the 5 colors of the Olympic rings. The Indian marched in arrowhead formation, erected 5 massive teepees, dispensed trinkets, danced and played the drums, all to the tune of La Danse Sauvage. The participants were bussed in for one all-night practice, and it was explained to them that the funding for the show was extremely limited, so they couldn't afford to bus them in for practice, and this is why they had the dance troupe lead them in. The tribute to Aboriginal people was based on stereotypes, of course, to convey the idea of multiculturalism, and they produced images that most spectators could identify with Hollywood versions of Indians, for instance, to instill in the crowd an identification with the attended messages. We see similar patterns in 1988 with Calgary. An example is on the medal itself. You can see an image of the athlete in the front, an Indian with a headdress in the back. The feathers are designed to display sporting equipment, skis, bobsleds, skates. There you have it. And along with 1988, the Lubicon were protesting a land claim settlement, and through the games they were trying to bring international awareness to their plight. And when they constantly inserted their political messages into the Olympic arena, the media responded back by saying they were trying to spoil Calgary's show. Salt Lake City is reminiscent of 1976. The local native tribes were invited to participate, but only if they could arrange themselves in vivid and dramatic displays. They came in on 5 pods where they played their music. The elders came out and blessed the crowd in their traditional languages, which the organizers had failed to translate, so that the message was actually lost to the audience. And here you see one of the elders coming in. The issue with the commodification of 2002, of course, wasn't lost on critics. Susan Schoenharjo is shown here saying, after the Indians had their moment in the spotlight, they danced back into history, making the way for miners, cowboys, and settlers of all races to do-si-do together, as if that ever happened. But these are just symbols, you say. Well, yeah, megabucks worth of symbols. Symbology that reaches millions of people around the world and leaves a lasting impression in place of reality. I'm concerned about Agenda 21 and how it's going to affect the relationship between marginalized groups of people and the commodification of their arts and their culture for Olympic profit. It may be true, what Gary Youngman says, that there is kind of no real template we can follow. One of our greatest challenges is that Indigenous participation is relatively new to the Olympic movement. There is no template we can follow, no clear indicators for how we measure our success. But what we can tell from past practices, from the long pattern of history of Aboriginal involvement, is that we are leading to an increased attention on the commodification of different cultural properties, artistic properties, whatever you want to call it. I know there was that discussion yesterday about the creative culture and culture, which I find really interesting. But I'm concerned about how people can use then the Olympic Games to get their messages across, rather than just being embedded in the Olympic commercial game. And there were a number of messages that Native people wanted to get across and didn't, some of which you can see here. So the benefits for Aboriginal people, well, as far as I can tell right now from the media, not much, really. There are still no benefits to sport. I work in sport, and I do national policy, and I also work with the National Aboriginal Sports Circle, and we're still waiting to see if there's any actual concrete benefits that flow. And to find out information about the four host First Nations is incredibly difficult because a lot of this information is actually on embargo for about 20 to 25 years. So as far as we can tell right now, the benefits are symbolic at best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice. We'll hand over to Robert Kerr to speak next.
Well, good morning, everyone. Nice to be here with you today. Nice to be back in Vancouver. And as far as today's presentation, as far as my presentation goes, not so much sort of theoretical or philosophical, but really more of a practical look back at the approach that we had determined we would take, we being the Cultural Olympiad team at VANOC, with respect to the Cultural Olympiad, how that played out, what the sort of top-line results were in some of the community and creative legacies, and then a look at some of the issues that could in fact be improved, some of the areas where there was perhaps a lack of opportunity or a failure to take advantage of the potential, the long-term potential of the games in terms of culture. The long-winded title for my presentation was kind of a working title, so in thinking about it a little bit further, I've kind of distilled it to leveraging the games to benefit arts and culture. So the fundamental premise on creating the Cultural Olympiad was to produce it in partnership, to work with the community. I came from the community myself. I was the founding executive director for Coastal Jazz and Blues Society and had worked in the community for 22 years or so in that role. So in seeing the big Olympic train approaching Vancouver on the horizon, it was... My thinking was not dissimilar from, say, what Norman articulated yesterday, Norman Armour from PUSH, in terms of, okay, what's the impact going to be on our organization? What are the potential benefits that we could derive from it? What would the potential negative impacts be? How do we navigate this incredibly huge event coming to our community, and what's our strategy for being involved in it? So I thought a lot about that prior to being asked to join VANOC, and so coming to VANOC, I was thinking about it through that lens, like, okay, what does it mean for the community? And having worked in this community for many, many years, I certainly had a great deal of respect for the community and believed that if we were going to do this, we needed to engage community deeply and on a wide level as well. Fortunately, my boss, Burke Taylor, the VP for Culture, had the same values and believed in that same premise. So we were certainly in sync on that. So we prioritized community over imported spectacle. And by believing in the community and the strength of the community to actually create great work and to determine and curate great work, I think we actually produced some pretty spectacular results. So our role was essentially the lead curator and festival producer. We did work with many different arts organizations, with 4 different municipalities, with the 4 host First Nations and other Aboriginal organizations across the country, and Place de la Francophonie. and also the funding partners, the federal government, all provinces and territories, corporate sponsors, and international cultural agencies. And their participation or contributions to our budget are more or less in line with their ranking there on the screen. So it was certainly a collective and a collaborative effort, and that kind of permeated our entire approach. We decided to focus the activity on the games periods, so on basically the February-March periods of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And this was largely for practical reasons. It was quite a strategic move. We could have spread our budget through the entire year for the 3-year period and taken that approach, or kept it all focused on 2010. But we decided to focus the limited resources we had. We had a $20 million budget through the organizing committee, which is a major budget for cultural activity, particularly in this part of the world, where we're used to rubbing nickels and dimes together. But when you get down to it, those dollars can disappear pretty quickly. So we felt in order to have impact, in order to do work of scale, in order to undertake some extraordinary and enable extraordinary possibilities, that we needed to focus our resources and also get people, help to make people aware. And this was an organizational imperative from VANOC that actually culture was a part of the games. And in order to do that, we thought it was important to focus on that games period. Now, contrary to what Duncan Lowe mentioned yesterday, in doing so, we didn't exclude the possibility of working with festivals that occurred, local festivals that occurred outside of this period. We worked with all kinds of arts organizations, not just festivals. We worked with theater companies, dance companies, music companies, galleries, media companies, new media organizations, etc. The Children's Festival example that he put forward, we certainly talked to the Children's Festival and talked to them about their ability to participate and do something that was certainly outside of their regular festival period. But they're a presenting organization, and nothing specifically prevented them from participating in the games. They just really didn't feel they had the capacity to do something during that period. Another example, the Vancouver Festival, they're actually constituted to present a summer festival, so it was kind of weird in that their mandate sort of precluded their participation. But I think that's the only organization that kind of specifically, according to their own mission and mandate, really couldn't partner with us because of our timing. So the questions, or the approach of working with the community was central, working across disciplines, having that collaborative, consultative approach was really critical, and dealing not only with local arts organizations and local artists, but also national organizations and national artists and international artists as well. We had quite an innovative digital program, the CODE program, Cultural Olympiad Digital Edition, and a national touring program as well. A great deal of my time, particularly the first year and a half, was talking to the community and finding out what the community was interested in. There was a great deal of anxiety in the community. There were a lot of people who were really concerned, okay, what is this impact going to be? How can we be involved? What will it mean for us? So it was important for me to go out and, personally and also professionally, to talk to people and present the core concept that we were developing and engage with the community for their feedback and input into that process. We ended up, through the course of 3 festivals, it was 4-week festival in 2008 and 2009, and then a 60-day festival in 2010, generating a great deal of work and reaching some pretty significant audiences. The strategy was to build from 2008 to 2009 to 2010. That played out both in terms of the financial resources that we allocated to each year and to the presenting and co-producing partnerships, and also to the size of the undertaking, if you will, to the scope and scale of the festivals that we presented over those 3 years. The idea was also to use these three progressively larger undertakings, cultural events, as a way of generating awareness and interest and an appreciation for culture's role in the games, and the fact that it was intended to be part of the activity. Now, it certainly is, in the grand scheme of things, dwarfed by sport. There's no question about that. You know, there's the three pillars of the Olympic Games: sport, culture, and sustainability, commonly referred to as one pillar and two toothpicks. So, you know, we were up against that right from the beginning, and that was, again, part of the rationale behind our strategy about going with the three-year approach, keeping it focused so we could have impact and engage not only the audiences through that, but also media, and get media understanding, the local media understanding, okay, culture is a part of this, and that hopefully by the time of the games, there would be significant media resources dedicated to covering the cultural program. Now, I didn't bring a summary of all that media coverage, but it was extensive. And for those of you here in Vancouver during the games, I think you'll agree and recall that we have never experienced that kind of media coverage for arts in this city on a sustained basis, a sustained daily basis. Pretty much, I mean, both the dailies were covering Cultural Olympiad in every paper, and we were getting front page stories as well as front page the entertainment section, and just regular previews, not just reviews, but previews of the various events, which, as anyone who works in the arts knows, is a difficult thing. In a normal state of affairs, we were really concerned that we would be swamped and kind of excluded from the media coverage, but that actually didn't occur. In terms of legacies and creative legacies, part of what we did was commission and co-commission work. And these are just 7 of the works that we co-commissioned or commissioned directly through Cultural Olympiad. Most of these were done in partnership with other arts organizations here in Vancouver or nationally. So the approach that we would take, which was outlined, referred to kind of in brief by Norman Armour and Michael Boucher and Jeff McMurtry yesterday, is that we would essentially ask for proposals or talk to people in the community, approach people and say, okay, send us your ideas, send us a summary. We had open calls that we undertook for each 3 years, but we also went out on a targeted basis to people and talked to people and had a lot of conversations around it. And said, what do you want to do? What are you interested in doing? Let's kind of, you know, dream together, work together, see what we can do that would be out of the ordinary, that would be beyond what we would typically be able to do with the resources that you have, by virtue of the fact that we have additional resources to bring to the table. And part of that manifested through these various commissions. There were also, excuse me, a number of major productions and co-productions, and these are just a few of them. Bruce Riddell's Beyond Eden was a work that had been in development for, I don't know, Mark, maybe you know, maybe, I think it was probably 10 or 15 years or more that he had been working on this musical theater piece based on sort of Aboriginal legend, and had never been able to get off the ground. And we were able to do it. We were able to help Bruce in the Vancouver, by partnering with the Vancouver Playhouse Theatre Company to produce that work, and it was pretty extraordinary. Vancouver Opera was able to create a new production of Nixon in China. So rather than bringing in Peter Sellers' famous production from LA, they were able to create their own. And it was a great production. It was picked up by San Francisco Opera, the Lyric Opera in Kansas City, and received excellent reviews. Something near and dear to my heart, but one of the giants of modern music, Anthony Braxton, a great unsung hero, an extraordinary piece of community-based, immersive performance called the Sonic Genome that involved 100 performers, only 13 of them from outside of this community, that played out over an 8-hour period at the Roundhouse Community Center in Vancouver. An amazing piece, and something that he had never been able to perform live before, one of the giants of modern music. And so those kinds of things we were able to do. Hive 3, the theater festival, the independent theater festival, we're able to enable that to happen, and for the third time that took place at Great Northern Way, and Code Live, the festival edition of the digital initiative. There were some interesting legacies in terms of new cultural events and spaces. We partnered with the Asian Canadian Special Events Association to fulfill their desire to create a pan-Asian lunar festival that got off the ground in 2009 and continues to this day, and they were able to expand that to Toronto as well, and that festival continues in Toronto as well around the Lunar New Year every year. The Satellite Gallery at 560 Seymour was an idea that the Belkin and Presentation House had that tied into the creation of a new nightclub at 560 Seymour. The folks who were producing that club were amenable, were interested in visual arts, so they had this idea of a gallery upstairs. Belkin and Presentation House didn't have the money to put into it, didn't have the resources to put into it. They were a little concerned about undertaking the risk and getting involved with it. So they kind of brought the idea to us. In the end, they weren't very involved in making it happen, but we worked really closely, our team, especially Marlene Madison, our chief curator for visual arts, put in an enormous amount of time and energy to actually make that space, realize that space as part of the reconstruction of that building, the renovation of that building. And subsequently, subsequent to the games, really happy to see that the 4 different galleries and universities have come together to enable that facility to carry on as an experimental, as a gallery for experimental works. So that's really cool. Community legacy, the idea of building capacities, confidence, relationships, networks. I think these, in many respects, the community legacies were the biggest things. This is where there was a newfound kind of confidence and assuredness within the community coming through all this. We realized that we stretched, the community stretched, and the community succeeded. Going through crazy negotiations around contracts with an organizing committee, it's a bit of a mind shift, but it was something that people learned from. And actually having the opportunity to work on that scale, to do those works of scale that Norman and Michael were referring to yesterday, it really demonstrated what's possible, not only for the organizations, but it opened the eyes and ears of the community here in terms of the audiences, understanding what the sort of next level could look like. And in fact, this should be the new normal. This should be what carries on. These are the kinds of things that should not just be a one-off. It's like, okay, we've stepped up to the plate. We know we can do this. We know there's an audience for it. People were constantly saying the Cultural Olympiad made the games worthwhile for me as a Vancouver citizen. So it also allowed us to get past that, well, gee, we never really have enough money, and if only we were in New York or London or Toronto, we could do the kind of work that we really want to work. Well, we actually did it, and it was great. So institutional legacies, talked a little bit about this yesterday, the Arts Partners in Creative Development. Not a lot of new money, but a way of focusing money, getting organizations to work together, institutions to work together in ways that they didn't normally work together. And it's set a precedent that I think should be carried on and followed up on. And the kind of thing where funding agencies can work together and actually pool their resources and collaborate for the benefit of the community. There was a federal, provincial, territorial roundtable on culture in the Games. These kinds of things don't happen very often with respect to culture. There are tri-level meetings that happen between the different funders on a regular basis to talk about issues, but we had focused monthly, bi-monthly meetings about how to involve the provinces and territories and the federal government in the Games. And we were able, through this process, we were able to leverage an additional $15 million in investment in Canadian artists participating in the Games. So it was pretty extraordinary. And that doesn't happen without a great deal of motivation and the kind of motivation and focus that a mega event, for better or worse, but a mega event brings to the table. This would not have happened without the Games. There are some things I like to call culture blockers, and one is certainly the Olympic Charter. This is a 100-page document, more or less. There are 2 sentences devoted to culture. So it's kind of lame. And on the one hand, it gives you a whole lot of room to do what you want to do, but it does not really direct the organizing committee in terms of mandating a strong cultural program. It's kind of, okay, and oh yeah, and by the way, you need to do a cultural program. The IOC itself, I think, probably quite cynically, in many respects, uses arts and culture to gain a lot of support within the community, to get buy-in, to enhance the experience and the engagement, but they're very reluctant to see the core organizing committee budget fund the cultural program. From the IOC's perspective, at least my reading of it, and it's only my reading of it, they would much rather see the national government, the regional governments, the local governments fund the cultural program in addition to what they've already spent on the Games, dedicated to the Games, which is a real disconnect because all of those public agencies have already invested huge amounts into the Games. So they're very reluctant to then pony up additional dollars to make the cultural program happen. So there's a real disconnect and an issue that needs to be addressed, should be addressed there. The organizing committee itself, 53 different functional areas. We were just one of them. And it's all about sport. Every functional area is there dedicated to making the sport competitions happen. That's what they do. And there are people who go from games to games to games, and they're professionals, and that's their focus. So many people within VANOC itself, we're in Cultural Olympiad, what's that? The transportation function didn't even have us on their radar. So the function that was dedicated to moving athletes and moving VIPs and all that around the Games, they had not dedicated any resources to Cultural Olympiad. Similarly with accommodations, you need hotels for artists. So we had to go out and do all that ourselves, basically. We had a bit of support from them internally. They tried to do their best, but they were squeezed, and ultimately we were left to more or less deal with that on our own. So that was a real challenge. And there really is not great transfer of knowledge from one game to the other. There's a whole transfer of knowledge program, the TOK program within the Olympics. So post-games and during the games, the next community that's hosting games, there are all kinds of transfer of knowledge sessions. We had those with LOCOG and also with Sochi. But in terms of the information that's captured officially, it's really minimal. I had to do most of my own research on what happened in previous Olympic Games in terms of the cultural program, and the reports were really weak. And I would have to say I don't think our report was much better, because you submit maybe a 40-page report, it gets distilled down to 5 or 6 pages. And so it really isn't very helpful for one, as part of that learning process. I just wanted to briefly look at, what the funders did and what that impact was. Duncan, some of Duncan's slides yesterday covered this ground as well. But, there certainly was an increase in funding leading up to the games, and then it dropped off. And that's really counterproductive. It should have at least stayed the same. To the BC Arts Council's credit and provincial government's credit here, they've, this past year have finally provided a pretty significant increase to the BC Arts Council budget. That's very good news. But there were like 3 years of angst in the community, and all the gains that we'd made through the Cultural Olympiad were kind of frittered away because people were like, oh my God, now I have to worry about survival. And that was mirrored as well through the gaming contributions, where again, significant drop-off post-games. So not helpful. I have to say the City of Vancouver did a much better job. They had some foresight to create a cultural tourism program that went through to 2011. Unfortunately, it wasn't renewed beyond the games to actually help facilitate other significant investment around special events. But they have managed to at least maintain a pretty level status there. So, what can be done to make it last? A few top of mind comments, I think these are some, not top of mind. These are some critical priorities that would have to be addressed for this culture to change significantly. And it really comes to the IOC. Love them or hate them, if a games, wherever the games go, obviously it's delivered by the IOC. And whether it's FIFA or whether it's Pan Am or whatever, there's an international body. So in the case of the IOC, the Olympic Charter is the driving force, and it has to be strengthened as far as the directive that it provides to the OCOG. And then the IOC would need to hold the OCOG accountable for delivering the cultural program through the bid process, through the dreaded COCOMs, the coordination commissions, which are the quarterly reviews, where the IOC delegation comes from Switzerland and elsewhere, and everybody in the organizing committee is on pins and needles for several days as they scrutinize the plans to date and try to keep you online. The final report needs to be much more robust, and that transfer of knowledge process much more robust. And ultimately, I think public funders need to look at the long game and realize that an event like this, I think if it's handled responsibly, if it engages community in a significant way, that it can really, it can benefit the community and stretch the community to a creative level and an engagement level that goes beyond what has happened before, but there needs to be follow-up. It can't just end with the games and magically think that, okay, then millions of new sponsors are going to come on board and you'll have fabulous new audiences that will increase ticket sales, 200% to make up the gap. There needs to be long-term investment. That doesn't mean mega millions, but it means additional resources have to be part of the plan. And that idea of building for success. So I'm probably out of time. But a few quick images of what we did. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Robert. We now have Kelsey Blair, who will be speaking finally.
All right, now for something completely different. As we can see sort of from the first slide of my presentation, I'm focusing on the sport part of the Olympics. So I'm hoping to provide a counterpoint to some of what we've seen already today and also yesterday in the conference. So, as we've seen throughout this conference, the outcomes of a mega event might include material and tangible, as well as symbolic and representational legacies. Through an analysis of the men's gold medal hockey match at the Vancouver 2010 Olympics, this presentation aims to examine one of the intangible aspects of the Vancouver 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games, its affective legacy. I will begin by using theater and performance studies methodologies to consider how the gold medal men's hockey game was positioned by Olympic organizers to become a defining moment of the Games. Then, drawing on work by American theater studies scholar Jill Dolan, I will attempt to more precisely define the feelings which circulated during the game. Yes, absolutely. Ultimately, I hope to examine how the men's gold medal match became an important temporal marker and cultural reference point for Vancouverites and open up the productive possibilities of considering art and sporting events in relation to each other. So mega events offer a genre of national and civic performance that is directed both outward toward an increasingly globalized community and inward toward local residents. As Wolfram Mansreiter argues, global spectacles, such as the Olympic Games, have been explained as occasions when cultures or societies reflect and define themselves, dramatize their collective myths and history, present themselves with alternatives, and eventually change in some ways while remaining the same in others. One of the conventional approaches to studying a mega event's national and civic performance is by examining what Canadian performance and theater studies scholar Erin Hurley calls representational labors, which she defines as representations that have a referential relation to an existing, if variable, idea of nation. They may support or contest that idea, and they are decoded through an analysis of signifier, the representation, and signified, the nation. However, in her book National Performance, Representing Quebec from Expo 867 to Celine Dion, Hurley offers an alternative to conventional modes of nation performance analysis. To build this new perspective, Hurley emphasizes the role of emotional labor over representational labors. Emotional labors, or those which, quote, make, manage, and distribute relationships through affective appeals, and draw people and objects, real and imaginary, into affective webs. For Hurley, emotional labor provides performance scholars with an alternate point of departure for perceiving the national, one which relies less on how performances stand in for nation than on how performances weave shared emotional repertoires. While I acknowledge that the performance of nation provided an essential backdrop to the affective climate of the 2010 Games, I'm primarily interested in Vancouver's civic performance relations. Hurley's term affection is a particularly useful analytical tool to examine the men's gold medal hockey match. Weaving together concepts from a range of affect theorists, Hurley explains, affects are ways of paying attention to the world, relational modes by which subject and object are put into contact with one another, a means of letting the world impress itself upon you and in putting yourself into the world. Analyzing Celine Dion, she introduces the concept of affection by locating Dion as a central figure in an affective web. She explains that people are drawn together by the intensity of their responses to common performances and experiences, but argues that these affective alliances do not homogenize experience. Rather, she suggests that, quote, in their disposition toward Dion, Québécois locate themselves within a geography whose coordinates correspond with various responses to Celine Dion, who is the geography's landmark. In what follows, I aim to demonstrate how, through the use of emotional labors, the gold medal men's hockey match became a figure of affection for Vancouverites, whereby an individual's disposition towards the game orients them in a geography where the match is the landmark. The 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games used mega event scale emotional labors from a range of fields, with some of which we've seen already at this conference, including graphic design, print media, and architecture, each of which used its own techniques to manage and move feeling. As has been discussed throughout the conference, one of the predominant critiques of the Olympics is the spectacle theory, which argues that the Olympics employ sensory codes to inspire positive emotional reactions in order to reduce controversy and conflict. I acknowledge the spectacle scale technologies which move and manage feeling in intentional ways and frequently function to obscure important social and political issues. However, for this paper, I'm interested in approaching the Vancouver Olympics and Paralympics as a spectacle scale performance practice where producers, in this case VANOC, the IOC, and their organizing partners, frame discrete multidisciplinary events within a mega event structure in order to examine how emotional labors function and to query their lasting effects. Due to time and space, I'm unable to provide an exhaustive account of all the feeling technologies employed at the 2010 Games. Instead, I have chosen two examples, one small and one large scale, which speak to the breadth and range of emotional labors utilized at the Games. In their article, How to Influence National Pride, the Olympic Medal Index as a Unifying Narrative, Hilvord, Elling, and Skottvis argue that prolonged multidisciplinary mega events like the Olympics use medal indexes as a means to construct large-scale narratives. The authors suggest that the medal index provides an overarching narrative for the mega event as a whole, while also allowing nations to identify where they stand in relation to one another. As evidenced by Canada's Own the Podium program, VANOC and the Canadian Olympic Committee was acutely aware of the importance of the medal index as a narrative framing device, particularly because Canada had not won any gold medals at the two previous Canadian-hosted Olympics. In brief, Own the Podium was a collaborative plan between multiple parties, including government, corporate, sport, and private sponsors, to help Canadian athletes, and I'm quoting from the website here, aim to be the #1 nation at the Olympic Winter Games and in the top 3 of the gold medal count at the 2010 Paralympic Winter Games. The program was well promoted nationally, and by February 2010, Own the Podium became a catchphrase frequently cited in media reports and commentary. However, as Van Hilvord, Elling, and Skottvis suggest, one of the challenges of constructing the Olympic narrative in terms of the medal index is that it can create expectations about the number of medals which should, might, or could be won. They argue that the narratives of expectancy have the potential to, quote, develop into a mirror of national identity. This is what we, as a nation, are worth. This is what we should win, otherwise we fail. By February 22nd, Own the Podium had a problem with its narrative of expectancy. It was impossible for Canada to finish first in the total medal count, one of the program's primary goals. Newspaper titles such as, "The team couldn't deliver, uh-oh, Canada," and "Apologies required, but not from athletes," one thing Own the Podium has succeeded at is to imbue its medalists with a sense of failure, began to circulate. However, due to a flurry of Canadian medal wins in the Olympics' second week, including several gold medals, Own the Podium was able to refocus the narrative. In an article in the Vancouver province on February 24th, Premier Gordon Campbell defended the Own the Podium program, saying, "Sure, there have been some disappointments, of course, for the athletes and for the rest of us, but I think 5 gold medals at a time when we've never won a gold medal at home is a pretty good start." Campbell's sentiments, which were echoed in media interviews by several other Own the Podium stakeholders, influenced the medal index to redirect the focus to Canada's gold medal tally. And on February 27th, Canada was awarded its 11th gold medal, setting the record for the most number of gold medals won by a host country. And by the final day of the Olympics, Canada was guaranteed to finish first in the gold medal index. And as a fun aside, on Wikipedia, when you pull up the medal indexes, you can rank them any way. But the 2010 has them ranked gold at the top, whereas the 2006 Olympics has them ranked in terms of total number of medals won. So when you automatically pull it up. So you can adjust it anyway, but I thought that was sort of a fun ranking, a fun fact. As such, by the time the puck dropped, for the gold medal men's hockey match, the Canadian team, meaning the Canadian Olympic athletes as a collective, was already perceived as being successful, significantly contributing a positively charged affective atmosphere. So in the rich discussion after yesterday's final panel, I was really struck by Robert's reference to TELUS ads in the CULT program, as it was an intriguing example of the range and detail of techniques used to guide audience experience and perception throughout the games. Here, I'd like to turn to a smaller and more detailed emotional labor which contributed to the affective charge of the men's gold medal hockey match: scheduling. The positive atmosphere, supported by the medal index narrative, would have been insignificant if it was not for the mega event schedule, which positioned the men's hockey game as the final sporting event of the Olympics. Compared to the large-scale efforts of the Own the Podium program, the scheduling of the game may appear insignificant. But this smaller feeling technology speaks to the range of emotional labors which contributed to the affective value of the men's gold medal hockey match. Sporting competitions are often plotted to begin with low-stakes events, such as heats or round-robin tournament play, and end with high-stakes events, such as finals. With progressively heightening stakes, the affective intensity typically builds throughout the competition for both competitors and spectators. By scheduling the men's gold medal hockey match as the final event, it was affectively charged both as the final sporting competition and the penultimate event of the Olympics, followed only by the closing ceremonies. While any sporting event scheduled as the final competition of the Games would accrue affective value, it is significant that hockey was awarded this spot on the schedule. As Bilg argues in his book Banal Nationalism, sport operates to bring people together, create national identity, and affirm or reaffirm national sentiments. Bilg's framework complements work in socio-cultural sports studies, which argues that sport functioned as a vehicle for the creation and maintenance of collective identities. Since hockey has played a role in nation building and nation maintenance for several participating countries, including Russia, Sweden, and Canada, organizers benefit from giving hockey the final slot on the program. This is particularly true in a Canadian-hosted Olympic Games, since hockey is one of Canada's two official national sports. In addition to the game day, the time of day also played a role in influencing the match's affective charge. Unlike most marquee sporting events, which take place early in the evening or late afternoon, the men's gold medal match began at 12:15 p.m. Of course, part of the game time was functional. It allowed time between the match and the closing ceremonies. However, we must remember that all scheduling is controlled by the organizers, and the noontime puck drop was significant for several reasons. First, unlike night events, which might discourage family attendance, it encouraged intergenerational spectatorship. Second, it used daylight to contribute to mood. While the atmosphere was celebratory, the party-style vibe was inflected by the broad daylight. This was not a nightclub, but a daytime event where both people and objects were in full view. This functioned to add further visibility to the heightened security presence, while also emphasizing the landscape outside the stadium. Colors and textures, such as the red mittens and flags carried by spectators, decorated the streets with details which would have been difficult to identify in the darkness of night. Of course, given the unpredictable nature of sport, there was no guarantee that organizers would capitalize on the emotional labors they utilized to position the game. However, from large-scale feeling technologies, such as the outdoor Jumbotron screens, which oriented non-ticket holding spectators around central locations, the festival-style atmosphere encouraged by the multiple pavilions and the events of the Cultural Olympiad, and the controversial and extremely problematic Assistance to Homeless Shelter Law, which gave the police the right to remove homeless Vancouver residents from the streets in order to sanitize the city's appearance, to the more detailed emotional labors, such as the visibility of the color red and the texture of the red mittens, the Olympic producers created the conditions for the gold medal men's match to be a defining moment of the Games. Now all that was needed from the Canadian men's hockey team was a win. Canada played against the United States in the gold medal game. The match boasted quick and intense play, and by the third period, Canada led the Americans 2-1. However, in the last minute of regulation play, the American team pulled their goalie to give them an extra attacker on the ice. Playing 6 against 5, the Americans scored with 24.4 seconds left in regular time, tying the game and forcing an overtime. In overtime in international hockey, the first team to score wins. 7 minutes and 40 seconds into the overtime period, Sidney Crosby's shot sailed through the American goalie's legs, and as they say, the crowd went wild. Described by media outlets as electric and joyous, the euphoria which erupted directly after the goal was transformed into a celebratory atmosphere which lasted several hours. In an article in the Vancouver Province, Kent Spencer and Sam Cooper described the atmosphere as, quote, a connective feeling of national joy took the crowds. A shared emotion, many said they'd never felt so strongly. So, What I want to investigate here is there a more precise way to describe the feelings which circulated during and shortly after the game? Popularized by anthropologist Victor Turner, communitas describes a moment of intense togetherness, social equality, and community spirit experienced during a ritual event. Turner argues that communitas is essentially an unmediated relationship between historical, idiosyncratic, concrete individuals, which preserves individual distinctiveness but encourages free relationships between people. The concept of communitas has been used to analyze collective experiences in a range of practices, including ritual, theater, music, and sport. Theater and performance studies scholar Jill Dolan expands on Turner's notion of communitas to build her concept of utopian performatives, which she defines as small but profound moments in which performance calls the attention of the audience in a way that lifts everyone slightly above the present into a hopeful feeling of what the world might be like if every moment of our lives were as emotionally voluminous, generous, aesthetically striking, and intersubjectively intense. For Dolan, utopian performatives are doings which allow for fleeting contact with an unstable, unfixed, unfinished utopia which gestures towards a better future. In the introduction to her book, Performing Utopias, she uses the example of The Chief, a one-man show about Steelers football team owner Art Rooney, produced by the Pittsburgh Public Theater. Dolan recounts how the Chief allowed her, a non-Steelers fan, to understand what it meant to root for the team. She writes, "I finally understood because of the expression of that powerful, moving commitment took place in a theater instead of a stadium. The production translated into terms through which I could relate to that heightened sense of community, of belonging, of desire, of utopias that communitas at a football game or a theater summons." From this passage, Dolan indicates that it is possible to experience utopian performatives in a stadium as well as in a theater. Framing the gold medal men's match as a utopian performative is productive because it allows us to more precisely examine the kinds of feelings which circulated during the match and the significance of these feelings afterwards. However, given the historical specificity of Dolan's conceptualization, which is deeply rooted in performance in the United States post 9/11, and her specific emphasis on theater, I'm reluctant to simply apply her term to a sporting context without analysis that's beyond the scope of this paper. As such, I'm describing the feeling of communitas experienced during the men's gold medal match as being similar to that of a utopian performative. Here, I'd like to return to the notion of civic performance relations as informed by Hurley's work on national performance. To explain the term affection, Hurley draws from cultural theorist Lawrence Grossberg's concept of a mattering map.
2 minutes.
Thank you. For Grossberg, mattering maps describe the ways in which people organize the meaningful objects in their lives. He writes, "These maps tell us where and how we become absorbed, not into the self, but into the world, as potential locations for our self-identifications and with what intensities. This absorption or investment constructs the places and events which are or can become significant to us. Affection is essentially a way of considering an object as a key coordinate on a nation performance or civic performance mattering map. Through a range of emotional labors intentionally utilized by Olympic organizers, such as the Own the Podium program and the scheduling of the game, the gold medal men's match was positioned as a potential figure of affection. However, the potential of the match was not realized until during the game, when spectators, both those inside and outside of the stadium, experienced a moment of intense communitas, resulting in a feeling similar to that of a utopian performative. Of course, the match's position in the popular imaginary was not cemented through lived experience alone. Representations, both the framing of the game through official media outlets and the more informal circulation of representations through social media, significantly contributed to the moment's lasting effects. Nonetheless, as a result of this lived experience and its subsequent framing and circulation through representation, the gold medal match became associated with an intense, if fleeting, positive feeling, resulting in its position as a defining moment of the games. Robert Pitter argues that the communitas experienced during a sporting event cannot translate into the creation of actual communities or any real social change. In the case of Vancouver, there's evidence to suggest the gold medal match's affective intensity had very little effective significance. In 2011, after losing the Stanley Cup final to Boston, Vancouver hockey fans rioted in the streets. However, this does not mean that the game lost its symbolic, representational, or affective value. Maurice Roach uses a phenomenological approach to mega events to argue that one of their functions is to provide a time structuring resource. He suggests that, both as short-term events but also in longer-term perspectives of their associated discourses of memory and traditions, and their organization of calendrical futures, mega events have the capacity to provide sociologically distinctive and significant intergenerational cultural markers and reference points. As a figure of affection, the gold medal match became a cultural time reference marker and reference point. Moreover, through its association with communitas and a feeling similar to that of a utopian performative, it became a cultural reference point which is perceived as being imbued with positive feelings. This is not to say that all Vancouverites respond to the match in a homogeneous way. To paraphrase Hurley, in their disposition toward the game, Vancouverites locate themselves within a geography whose coordinates correspond with the various responses to the gold medal game as the landmark. In other words, a negative orientation toward the game is as significant as a positive one. Love it or hate it, you're oriented around it. In her welcoming remarks, Karen highlighted how scholars often look at the affective impact of mega events, and the Olympics in particular, with mistrust. Drawing on the spectacle theory, scholars have rightly worried about how the management of feeling is being used to obscure and distract. Certainly, in the case of the gold medal men's hockey match, we could argue that this was the case. As I've argued throughout this paper, the men's gold medal game did not become a figure of affection by accident. Emotional labors were intentionally used to position the match in a way which maximized its potential of becoming a defining moment of the games. However, by examining these emotional labors, we are more accurately able to analyze how a performance contained within a mega event's frame inspires certain emotional responses. Moreover, in terms of the broader theme of this conference, as an important coordinate in the game's mattering map, the better we understand the men's gold medal match, the more able we are to analyze other coordinates, such as artistic events, in relation to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite all the presenters to join the table. We have, unfortunately, just between 10 and 15 minutes for discussion. So I won't provide any kind of synthesis, but I did have just a couple of points, because clearly there are three very different presentations on the one hand, but actually what I was struck by was the way in which all three focused on relationships across policy, funding, and affect, performances and their performatives. And I think what all three presentations demonstrated is that it's overly simplistic to think around the Olympics in terms of representation per se. And Kelsey, you dealt with that most in an upfront way. But the way in which some critical scholarship around the Olympics tends to focus on the on misrepresentation, although as if there were some kind of originary, authentic nation or culture to represent. And I think across all three presentations, what's been demonstrated is also the diversity of practices within, whether those are the diverse practices within the Cultural Olympiad, or whether the diversity within Aboriginal communities who participate in the Olympics. They're not monolithic either. And also in terms of hockey sticks, whether you love hockey or you loathe it, you're still orientated around it, but in very different ways. And I think what all three presentations speak to is the way in which the Olympics are complex material discursive boundary-making practices, that they're complex assemblages of interacting forces of capital, of culture, of infrastructure. I think as well, what's interesting, and I know that Karen in her opening remarks was talking about the suspicion that we might approach those affective dimensions, but I guess we also do need to remind ourselves that the flip side of the romantic intensities that circulate and are performed through the Olympics are the realities of the infrastructural and political dismantlings of the very things to which these emotions appeal. So that's always held in tension, I think, around our conversations around the Olympics. So for me, I think what I'd like maybe each of you to address are the links across the different areas that you're exploring. Because I think within Aboriginal participation in the Olympics, it's absolutely a structure of feeling. It has that same emotional intensity. I get the lump in my throat, even though I know it's hooey, but in an Olympic ceremony, I get the similar kind of lump in my throat when I see participation of the 4 host First Nations and the strategic way in which the chiefs of the 4 host First Nations delayed their entry into the stadium, as I would do with the hockey final. And just thinking around how affect and emotion also operate within the Cultural Olympiad. So is that too difficult a task? I'm just wondering if in listening to each other's presentations, whether you were picking up on links across them. I wonder who might like to take up that challenge first.
And just to let you know, the handheld is live.
Thank you, Janice. That's a fascinating question, and we could be here all day, I suppose. One of the things that struck me about Kelsey's presentation is, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of the way it's positioned in the gold medal hockey game. And if you look back to the last several Winter Olympics, that has been the case, and it's certainly not by chance. Everything is scripted for the show, and I think that's perhaps one of the connected pieces across all of this that you can't lose sight of from when if you look at it in sort of a very unsentimental way or unemotional way, kind of clinical. It's a show. It's a big show, and it's constructed to achieve a result. And so that's, for me, I think that's probably what one of the connected pieces of all this.
When I was doing my PhD comps years ago, there was a question that one of the members asked me, and I didn't like the question, and I didn't know how to answer it, so I didn't. And when it came to the oral defense, they said, well, why didn't you answer this question? Because, we might have to fail you. And that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. And I said, well, I didn't like the question, first of all. And so one of the members said, well, why don't you change the question? And it had never occurred to me that I could change the question. I thought I had to answer what they asked me, so I'm going to change the question a little bit. It's a good question, but I think just for me it doesn't really work because I don't know if I look at the games in the same way. I'm not a very good spectator, and so I'm not someone who sits in the stands and likes to cheer people on. And so I'm someone you don't want to have at your sporting event because I'll be wandering off somewhere else. So for me, when I think about Aboriginal involvement in the games, I mean, I understand, how the way in which the history and the discourse around their involvement, is being mobilized in order to support the idea of nation and the idea that Canada is a peace-making country, that it's a unified country, that it's a diverse country where everybody is accepted, and you should come to Canada because life will be so much better here. So I understand how all of this was constructed to make that story prominent. But I don't see it that way. I take a look at the way in which these discourses are being mobilized and the agreements that people have to sign in order to participate in that nation. Who is not participating in the nation? Which politics are being marginalized? And I mean, it's the same for hockey. I look at it from an ableist point of view, from a gendered point of view. The men didn't even go to the closing ceremony. Meanwhile, the women's hockey team was being threatened from, for their display of celebration on the ice when they won the gold medal. And women's hockey was, Jacques Rogue was threatening to cut them from the Olympic program altogether. So I don't see it so much in the same way. I see these events as being divisive, and I get really concerned with the way in which the public is being mobilized to support this broader idea of nation and how little they are being engaged critically. And I wonder, what I want to know, are there opportunities to engage people to actually think through an event like the Olympic Games? Because we are not encouraged to think at the Olympic Games. It's a distraction. I mean, when I teach my Olympic issues course at Western, students always come in and they think it's going to be a big celebration of the Olympic Games, and they walk out with this totally different view of the Games. And I say, look, I'll put a Coke can out here, and I'll say, if you open up this can, what you get is a lifetime of happiness. So can we create a whole movement around this can of Coke, like we can around the Olympic Games? Because that's what's happening. That's what the Olympics are. It's just a celebration of corporate culture that opens up different political areas to mobilize that capital in that area. So I see it somewhat differently. It's really hard for me to talk about the Games that way.
I obviously, one of the things that I was really interested in and just is looking at the way that obviously the Olympics mobilize feeling. And particularly there was an article, I couldn't include it because of the length of the paper, that addressed the impact of the Cultural Olympiad specifically as a tool which influences the mood of the Games throughout the Games. It was a study done by, I think I'm getting their names right, is Hiller and Wanner out of the University of Calgary. And they argued that, or they did a study suggesting that one of the effects of the actual festival of the Olympics is that it has a positive impact on people's perception of the Games. So basically, people might feel very negative leading up to the Games, but the actual experience of the Games tends to influence them in a positive way. And they highlight the Cultural Olympiad as an important part of that. And so I would be really interested, or would have been really interested in this, to take a look at the events of the Cultural Olympiad and how they supported sort of actually the gold men, the atmosphere leading to the match, and also how they provided other points of affection or other points of mattering on the map of how Vancouverites identified to the Olympics.
Did you want to point? And then I'll pass over to the audience. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you, all three of you. This has been a really illuminating panel and also a really entertaining one, which is terrific for a 9 a.m. start. I have a very brief anecdote that cathects with Kelsey's paper, and then I have a question for Robert and Janice, if that's okay. I remember very well the gold medal match because I was on an airplane, specifically a WestJet airplane, that's going to be important in a second, flying from Calgary to London, Ontario as a result of Susan Bennett having brought me out to Calgary for various things. And very importantly, the video screens on the plane weren't working. And this created a kind of mini riot in the boarding area at the Calgary airport. So what happened was, in the last 5 minutes of the game, the pilots hooked us into radio signals from the ground and broadcast the game audio through the speakers on the plane. And as you can imagine, it was crackly. It was a bit like being in the early 20th century. And we were all listening with bated breath, even those of us who weren't Canadian, apparently, to exactly what Kelsey described, the last-minute goal and then the overtime goal. And as you can also imagine, we all went wild, even though many of us were incredible skeptics, or I was an incredible skeptic. Maybe there weren't others. I don't know. And at the end, after we'd all finished partying, as you do on a plane in a teeny tiny seat, the WestJet crew came out with complimentary beer for the 2 American passengers on the plane, and we all went wild again. And I wanted to tell that anecdote because, first of all, I remember my feeling on the plane. I remember connecting to that passionate sort of sense of nationalism that comes with connecting to the men's hockey team. Also because I've dined out on it for years, and because every time I tell it, I don't know why, but every time I do, I mention that it was a WestJet plane. And of course, WestJet, for those of you who aren't Canadian, you should know that WestJet is a kind of Western rival to Air Canada, and is particularly, it gets its sort of advertising heft from this notion of being particularly friendly, a kind of Canucky in a Western way, and that's its logo, that's its brand. So it's interesting to me that somehow this total epic fail of the plane's technology turned into a kind of perfect WestJet advert that I seem to be repeating endlessly as I tell the story of my own effective pull to the hockey game. I feel like that might be a kind of perfect metonym for how the Olympics work. You know, I feel, and then I accidentally connect that to corporate power and repeat it ad nauseum. And I really hope that I haven't encouraged people to, I actually don't like WestJet, but whatever. In any case, I seem to have become a kind of corporate arm of WestJet as a result of that. That anecdote aside, I hope, Kelsey, it's of use to you. I'm curious, given the papers that you presented and also the comments that you just made, Janice, I'm genuinely interested to know if you think there is any way that the kind of the kind of politics that typically get marginalized at these events, in particular Aboriginal participation and anti-colonial resistance by Aboriginal communities, is there any way that that can actually have a real presence at any of these events? Is there a way to make a space for that kind of politics, or is it perhaps more important to step away? I find myself cynical and anxious about that.
It's becoming increasingly difficult for groups, any group, to make a political statement at the game. I mean, athletes can't do it. It's written into the charter, or they'll be kicked out of the games. And since Beijing, what the IOC has done is cordoned off areas where you can do official protests, but even then you have to apply. You may not get accepted, so your protest has to be official. And certainly you can only behave in certain ways on Olympic grounds because, like I said, it's a different paramilitary area. So you're not in Vancouver, Canada anymore. I was here yesterday, and what I love about coming to conferences like this and just talking to people about their experiences from the games is hearing the real life stories about what people actually do in order to make a statement that that doesn't necessarily fit within the traditional protest kind of experience. And so in the morning panel, there was a woman here speaking about, I think, an Aboriginal organization that she was working with. And they used the money that they got from, I believe it was a host or perhaps a corporate sponsor, I can't remember which, in order to hire a historian to map out their land claims issue. And I thought, well, that's pretty neat, because you could never apply for funding and say, well, I'm going to use your money, to get our land back. And so I thought that was actually pretty neat. And to me, it speaks to the creative ways that people are using the arts to achieve their political ends. And that's where my interest is in, just because it is incredibly difficult within the confines of the Olympic space to do anything on your own creatively that doesn't align with Olympic values. And those are politics, of course, in itself, but I'm more interested in the anti-colonial kind of politics and listening to what it is that people do in their own way. They may not think it's anti-colonial, but I'm sitting here understanding the structure of the games, how it's funded, how it's organized, and I think, wow, that's pretty neat. I would love to know more stories like that. And I don't know if social media is one way of getting this information out there. Part of me is hesitant to even share this information outside of a verbal area to actually have it recorded, because I know there will be a way in the future where then what you do with the money will be circumscribed. So perhaps I'm even more skeptical than you. I think this should be talked about and shared. I just don't think it should be recorded, because the power of the Olympic industry is so pervasive. It's really hard to move around it. In order to change the structure, you have to, I think, do away with the structure of the IOC and completely revamp its relationship to the corporate sponsors and make the corporate sponsors accountable, make the IOC accountable, make it transparent. The IOC doesn't fund a lot of the games. The IOC makes billions and keeps a lot of that money, and then it's the hosts, which becomes a corporation, that also has to raise its own money. So there's multiple layers of money coming in that only ever gets a little bit funneled down to people in the community. All of this is very structured. So I'm even more skeptical than you.
Before we move on to Robert, I just needed to tell you a detail that you were talking about. It was Lorna Brown's Digital Natives that you're talking about. It was actually a post-Olympic event. Okay. It was a shoulder event she was describing. So, sorry.
I just wanted to respond to that, Janice. And I think, in fact, the Cultural Olympiad was one forum in which critical perspectives on colonial culture, on corporate culture, on the games itself could be put forward and were put forward. Certainly through a number of the works by Aboriginal artists within the Cultural Olympiad. Marie Clements, Edward Curtis Story, Arthur Renwick's incredible exhibition Mask, Where the Blood Mixes, played by Kevin Loring, and some of Dana Claxton's work with this incredible billboard of her work up, Cheryl Hirondell, and others. Were certainly, we did not censor the works that came through, and in fact we're really delighted by the challenging nature of many of the works by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal artists that came through the doors. As Norman described, the comp piece yesterday is still one of the most powerful pieces of theater I've ever seen. And so I think there is a place for critical discourse through the cultural program, and maybe that's one of the benefits of it. It's detailed content being somewhat overlooked by the organizing committee and the IOC. That it's a bit marginalized and a bit under the radar. In the big picture, they want to know what it's about, but they don't go into the granular on it. And that might be a rather convenient state that we don't want to upset. If a city, a community, a society wants to host the games and wants to take advantage of that for culture.
Janice, is it all right if I take another question?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I think have we got time for one more? Because you had your hand up.
We're going to start the next session at 11. So we can
Okay, great. So one more. Karen.
Actually, I'm happy to hear from Janice.
Okay.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I agree with Robert, and I actually see, and so I'm not familiar with the work of the Cultural Olympiad. I have to admit, this is really kind of my first sustained space that I've been in, where I've heard people talk about what they do. For me, I see it as another protest space. I see it in the same way, where these spaces are being demarcated, where people can make political statements that are appropriate. And what I want to know, what I'm really interested in, are the actual politics, the real lived experiences of people. So people can make statements in these confined spaces, but I want to know what happens before and what happens afterwards. So in British Columbia, for instance, they're not called land claims here. I think they're more like settlements. And Christine O'Bonsawin and a few other people are mapping the rate at which those settlements were moved through the BC system in order to enable the creation of the 4 host First Nations, for instance, in order for the games to take place on Aboriginal land. And what I would want to know is, well, if those land claims and those settlements are being sped up in order to move through the system, who is really benefiting from that? We know about the Stolen Sisters, which really didn't gain any attention politically, financially, until recently. There's tons of housing issues, educational issues, health issues that still need to be addressed for Aboriginal people, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations. And this is just one group of people. I mean, there's the homeless, and the Kidnapping Act is just one act. There were a number of policies in BC and Vancouver that were mobilized in order to enable the paramilitary service to clear the homeless off the streets. The way in which new street designs doesn't allow people to spend time in public spaces. You have to shop in order to be in these spaces. So people who can't afford to shop can't be there. And the clearing of the people out into other areas of the city that aren't Olympic controlled. So I'm more interested in the way in which all of these distractions are being used to enable to say, well, okay, no, but there's protest spaces, and look at the art, because we didn't really censor that. And, you know, look at the way in which protests are being allowed in the Olympic space. But really, to me, these are still distractions that detract from our interest in the real politics, the racial politics, the able-bodied politics, the ethnic politics, poverty, you name it.
At the same time, what's really interesting in an international context during, I think this is on, yeah, during Vancouver 2010, normally in international media, Vancouver is presented as the most livable city in the world, it's gorgeous, et cetera, but during the Olympics, in The Guardian and every other newspaper, for the first time ever, there was coverage of First Nations and Aboriginal politics and of homelessness as a problem in Vancouver. So despite the distraction, it was the only time that those political issues were discussed. You need the mic, sorry.
And and I like the way social media is being used now to broadcast those politics and to share information, because it's hard to ignore what it is that people are saying anymore because of the prevalence of social media and the way activist groups are using these spaces to broadcast their messages.
And perhaps somebody out there can recall a little bit better than I do, but there was, in fact, sort of an alternate space created for social media in the city through
W2.
W2, yeah, exactly. That brought in non-accredited media, primarily working within the realm of social media to comment on the games, comment on the on the impact on society. So there was, perhaps you would consider that another sort of protest zone, what have you, but it wasn't official. It certainly wasn't official. It was done. It was a community-based initiative.
So one more question, or do you want us to? Okay. Karen, did you want to?
Well, I'm preaching to the converted here, but I think as a society in Canada, we should reflect on why it is we continue to mobilize around predominantly white, able-bodied males, throwing a puck around and calling it national celebration as primarily our national celebration and as an identifier as who we are as a nation. I know that everyone in this room already knows that. But I guess one of the things that strikes me as I was listening to the papers is this idea of culture as decoration and Aboriginal participation as decoration. So that Coke can that you bring into your seminar room, I guess I'm slightly horrified by some of the images that you showed of the Coke can, also that Aboriginal imagery and iconography being wrapped around the Coke can. And so the ways in which that iconography is co-opted. And so, I don't know, this isn't really a question. It's more of a point that it feels worrisome to know that culture and Aboriginal participation and identity are being used as these decorative markers.
Robert?
I just wanted to point out that artists are in turn reappropriating those corporate images for their own comment. And Sunny Asu's piece, welcome to Coast Salish, or enjoy Coast Salish territory, perfect example of that.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think that's a good place for us to end. I want to thank our three fantastic speakers, Robert, Janice, and Kelsey. I think we have 15 minutes now for coffee and muffins or whatever's up there. And we start again at 11. So join us all. Thank you.